Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we are now going to be working with the Julio Alvarez text, My English. Before we get there though, I want to be with you on page 101 because both a White House Diary and My English are paired together under a common literary analysis topic at 2B. Let's write it down now. As we turn to the text, My English, we want to be focusing on the topic of voice. Now, as we said in the earlier lecture, this is, again, I'm reading with you on page 101, the way in which a writer sounds on the page. It's related, of course, again, to the author's purpose, the author's point of view, the author's style, of course, somewhat the author's purpose as well, word choice, tone or attitude, sentence structure. The other thing we want to point out here is the autobiographical writing. Yes? In other words, we're always considering the fact that when we write autobiographically, we are writing in the first person, I, me, my, that kind of thing. If we're writing biography, of course, that's somebody else writing about you or someone writing about somebody else. Now, as we begin this text, My English, we want to pay attention on page 112 to the guiding question. Do you think truth can change over time? As well, we want to point out this vocabulary word stuff there. Make sure you scan those words. If there are any of those words you don't know, then obviously you want to put those in your annotations as well and be looking for them as we get to our study here in a moment. Let's meet Julio Alvarez, great writer, on page 113. Notice her dates, 1950 she's born, she's still alive. Let's read together. When her family fled the Dominican Republic and returned to New York, Julio Alvarez was 10 years old, so you want to write that down. So in other words, she has to leave her country at 10 years old. Again, I'm reading on page 113. Painfully aware of not fitting in, Julia took refuge in reading and making up stories. She says, quote, I landed not in the United States, but in the English language. That became my new home, end quote. Alvarez attended Middlebury College, where she won several poetry awards. She later earned a master's degree in creative writing from Syracuse University. Alvarez says that writing is, quote, a way to understand yourself. I like that quote. I would suggest you write it down. This is what we call discovery writing. We write not because we know what we want to say, but we learn what we have to say. Discovery writing. It's a beautiful way to think about writing. Her writing has been praised for its humor, its sensitivity, its insight. And then finally, one of Julio Alvarez's books, In the Time of the Butterflies, was made into a film starring Salma Hayek. Let's go ahead and look at the background for this autobiography. Alvarez is two nationalities. Julio Alvarez, the author of My English, was born in New York, grew up in the Dominican Republic, a small Caribbean nation. An independent state since 1844, the Dominican Republic has often struggled with foreign conquest, political unrest, dictatorship. Alvarez's family was forced to return to New York in 1960 because her father had participated in a movement against the brutal Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo. Okay, let's turn now to page 114 and following. We have some information on page 115 there about the Dominican Republic, right? You can see your map information as well. I can kind of help place the text for you. Now, let's make a quick observation. This is going to be a text that involves a conflict. So write this down at 2B. The conflict. The conflict that I'm going to ask you to focus on here will be the learning of a language. And let's write this down as well. The way a language is part of a culture. So that when, for example, she drops into New York City, she says it, I had to learn a language, but that's a cultural thing too, and all of the expectations of the culture. So as we read this text together, we want to be paying attention to what were those conflicts? What was the nature of that struggle in those conflicts? And of course at 3B, we'll be asking this question. What is the greatest struggle you ever had in your life? Jot that one down. We'll be coming back to it. What is the greatest struggle? 3B, we're trying to relate to this person. What is the greatest struggle? For some of us, it was language if we, for example, had to learn English as our second language. For others of us, it was a different kind of struggle, but we'll be able to hopefully to relate. Okay, let's study along. My English with Julio Alvarez.
My English by Julia Alvarez. Mommy and Papi used to speak it when they had a secret they wanted to keep from us children. We lived then in the Dominican Republic, and the family as a whole spoke only Spanish at home, until my sisters and I started attending the Carol Morgan School, and we became a bilingual family. Spanish had its many tongues as well. There was the Castellano of Padre Joaquin from Spain, whose lisp we all loved to imitate. Then the educated Espanol my parents' families spoke, aunts and uncles who were always correcting us children, for we spent most of the day with the maids and so had picked up their bad Spanish. Campesinas they spoke a lilting, animated campuno, S's swallowed, endings chopped off, funny turns of phrases. This campuno was my true mother tongue, not the Spanish of Calderón de la Barca, or Cervantes or even Neruda, but of Chucha, and Iluminada, and Gladys, and Ursulina from Juncalito, and Lisi, and Boca de Yuma, and San Juan de la Maguana. Those women yacked as they cooked, they story-told, they gossiped, they sang. Boleros, merengues, canciones, salves. Theirs were the voices that belonged to the rain and the wind, and the teeny, teeny stars even a small child could blot out with her thumb. Besides all these versions of Spanish, every once in a while, another strange tongue emerged from my papi's mouth or my mommy's lips. What I first recognized was not a language, but a tone of voice, serious, urgent, something important, and top secret being said, some uncle in trouble, someone divorcing, someone dead. Say it in English so the children won't understand. I would listen, straining to understand, thinking that this was not a different language, but just another and harder version of Spanish. Say it in English so the children won't understand. From the beginning, English was the sound of worry and secrets, the sound of being left out. I could make no sense of this harder Spanish, and so I tried by other means to find out what was going on. I knew my mother's face by heart. When the little lines on the corners of her eyes crinkled, she was amused. When her nostrils flared and she bit her lips, she was trying hard not to laugh. She held her head down, eyes glancing up when she thought I was lying. Whenever she spoke that gibberish English, I translated the general content by watching the Spanish expressions on her face. Soon I began to learn more English at the Carol Morgan School. That is when I had stopped gawking. The teacher and some of the American children had the strangest coloration. Light hair, light eyes, light skin, as if Ursulina had soaked them in bleach too long. Todo teñido. I did have some blonde cousins, but they had deeply tanned skin. And as they grew older, their hair darkened, so their earlier paleness seemed a phase of their acquiring normal color. Just as strange was the little girl in my reader who had a cat and a dog that looked just like un gatito y un perrito. Her mommy was mother and her papi father. Why have a whole new language for school and for books with a teacher who could speak it teaching you double the amount of words you really needed? Butter, 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 butter. All day, one English word that had particularly struck me would go round and round in my mouth and weave through all the Spanish in my head until by the end of the day, the word did sound like just another Spanish word. And so I would say, Mommy, please pass la mantequilla. She would scowl and say it in English. I'm sorry, I don't understand. But would you be needing some butter on your bread? Why my parents didn't first educate us in our native language by enrolling us in a Dominican school, I don't know. Part of it was that Mommy's family had a tradition of sending the boys to the States to boarding school and college, and she had been one of the first girls to be allowed to join her brothers at Abbott Academy, whose school song was our lullaby as babies. Although Columbus and Cabot never heard of Abbott, it's quite the place for you and me. She had become quite Americanized. It was very important, she kept saying, that we learn our English. She always used the possessive pronoun, your English, an inheritance we had come into and must wisely use. Unfortunately, my English became all mixed up with our Spanish. Mix-up, or what's now called Spanglish, was the language we spoke for several years. There wasn't a sentence that wasn't colonized by an English word. At school, a Spanish word would suddenly slide into my English like someone butting into line. Teacher, whose face I was learning to read as minutely as my mother's, would scowl but no smile played on her lips. Her pale skin made her strange countenance hard to read, so that I often misjudged how much I could get away with. Whenever I made a mistake, teacher would shake her head slowly. In English, Julia, there's no such word as columpio. Do you mean a swing? I would bow my head, humiliated by the smiles and snickers of the American children around me. I grew insecure about Spanish. My native tongue was not quite as good as English, as if words like columpio were illegal immigrants trying to cross a border into another language. But teachers discerning grammar and vocabulary patrol ears could tell and send them back. Soon I was talking up an English dorm. "Did you eat English parrot?" my grandfather asked one Sunday. I had just enlisted yet one more patient serving to listen to my rendition of Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers at breakneck pace. Huh? I asked him politely in English, putting him in his place. Cat got your tongue? No big deal, so there. Take that, holy Toledo. Our teacher's favorite curse word. Go jump in the lake. Really dumb. Golly, gosh. Slang, cliches, sayings, hotshot language that our teacher called, ponderously, idiomatic expressions. Riddles, jokes, puns, conundrums. What is yellow and goes click, click? Why did the chicken cross the road? See you later, alligator. How wonderful to call someone an alligator and not be scolded for being disrespectful. In fact, they were supposed to say back, in a while, crocodile. There was also a neat little trick I wanted to try on an English-speaking adult at home. I had learned it from Elizabeth, my smart alecky friend in 4th grade, whom I alternately worshipped and resented. I'd ask her a question that required an explanation, and she'd answer, because. Elizabeth, how come you didn't go to Isabel's birthday party? Because. Why didn't you put your name in your reader? Because. I thought that's such a cool way to get around having to come up with answers. So I practiced saying it under my breath, planning for the day I could use it on an unsuspecting English-speaking adult. One Sunday at our extended family dinner, my grandfather sat down at the children's table to chat with us. He was famous, in fact, for the way he could carry on adult conversations with his grandchildren. He often spoke to us in English so that we could practice speaking it outside the classroom. He was a Cornell man, a United Nations representative from our country. He gave speeches in English. Perfect English, my mother's phrase. That Sunday he asked me a question. I can't even remember what it was because I wasn't really listening but lying in wait for my chance. Because, I answered him. Papito waited a second for the rest of my sentence and then gave me a thumbnail grammar lesson. Because has to be followed by a clause. Why is that? I asked, nonplussed. Because, he winked. Just because. A beginning wordsmith, I had so much left to learn. Sometimes it was disheartening. Once the august, the family intellectual, put a speck of salt on my grandparents' big dining table during Sunday dinner. He said, imagine this whole table is the human brain. Then this teensy grain is all we ever use of our intelligence. He enumerated geniuses who had perhaps used 2 grains, maybe 3. Einstein, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Beethoven. We children believed him. It was the kind of impossible fact we thrived on, proving as it did that the world out there was not drastically different from the one we were making up in our heads. Later, at home, Mommy said that you had to take what her younger brother said with a grain of salt. I thought she was still referring to Theogus's demonstration, and I tried to puzzle out what she was saying. Finally, I asked what she meant. Taking what someone says with a grain of salt is an idiomatic expression in English, she explained. It was pure voodoo, is what it was. What later I learned poetry could also do. A grain of salt could symbolize both the human brain and a condiment for human nonsense. And it could be itself, too, a grain of salt to flavor a bland plate of American food. When we arrived in New York, I was shocked. A country where everyone spoke English. These people must be smarter, I thought. Maids, waiters, taxi drivers, doormen, bums on the street, all spoke this difficult language. It took some time before I understood that Americans were not necessarily a smart or superior race. It was as natural for them to learn their mother tongue as it was for a little Dominican baby to learn Spanish. It came with mother's milk, my mother explained, and for a while I thought a mother tongue was a mother tongue because you got it from your mother's milk, along with proteins and vitamins. Soon it wasn't so strange that everyone was speaking in English instead of Spanish. I learned not to hear it as English, but as sense. I no longer strained to understand, I understood. I relaxed in this second language. Only when someone with a heavy Southern or British accent spoke in a movie, or at church when the priest droned his sermon, only then did I experience that little catch of anxiety. I worried that I would not be able to understand, that I wouldn't be able to keep up with the voice speaking in this acquired language. I would be like those people from the Bible we had studied in religion class, whom I imagined standing at the foot of an enormous tower that looked just like the skyscrapers around me. They had been punished for their pride by being made to speak different languages so that they didn't understand what anyone was saying. But at the foot of those towering New York skyscrapers, I began to understand more and more, not less and less, English. In 6th grade, I had one of the first in a lucky line of great English teachers who began to nurture in me a love of language, a love that had been there since my childhood of listening closely to words. Sister Maria Generosa did not make our class interminably diagram sentences from a workbook or learn a catechism of grammar rules. Instead, she asked us to write little stories imagining we were snowflakes, birds, pianos, a stone in the pavement, a star in the sky. What would it feel like to be a flower with fruits in the ground? If the clouds could talk, what would they say? She had an expressive, dreamy look that was accentuated by the wimple that framed her face. Supposing, just supposing, my mind would take off soaring into possibilities, a flower with fruits, a star in the sky, a cloud full of sad, sad tears, a piano crying out each time its back was tapped, music only to our ears. Sister Maria stood at the chalkboard. Her chalk was always snapping in two because she wrote with such energy, her whole habit shaking with the swing of her arm, her hand tap, tap, tapping on the board. Here's a simple sentence. The snow fell. Sister pointed with her chalk, her eyebrows lifted, her wimple poked up. Sometimes I could see wisps of gray hair that strayed from under her headdress. But watch what happens if we put an adverb at the beginning and a prepositional phrase at the end. Gently, the snow fell on the bare hills. I thought about the snow. I saw how it might fall on the hills, tapping lightly on the bare branches of trees. Softly, it would fall on the cold, bare fields. On toys children had left out in the yard, and on cars, and on little birds, and on people out late walking on the streets. Sister Marie filled the chalkboard with snowy print on, handling and shaping and moving the language, scribbling all over the board until English, those verbal gadgets, those tricks and turns of phrases, those little fixed units and counters became a charged, fluid mass that carried me in its great fluid waves, rolling and moving onward to deposit me on the shores of my new homeland. I was no longer a foreigner with no ground to stand on. I had landed in the English language.
All right, now let's turn to this text and the ways in which this is really a brilliantly constructed essay about how one comes into culture by coming through language, how one comes to oneself by coming through language. Of course, let's just pause for a moment and let's just remind ourselves as freshman students how miraculous it is that the words I'm speaking right now, you can understand. If I started speaking, for example, in another language, unless you knew the language, you'd have no clue. You know I was saying something, but you wouldn't have any idea what I was saying. Why is it that we can learn language in the first place? It's a phenomenal mystery that one day you don't know a word and the next day you do know a word. Of course, let's point out, language is taught to us and we learn language and we use language, but it's part of a culture, right? And of course, learning about that culture is significant as well. We will, of course, pick that one up. Let's just start, though, at 2b really quickly. We began here, so let's end here our lecture and point out at 2b that this is an autobiographical essay where we are experiencing this thing called voice. Notice how in the writing, Julio Alvarez is able to kind of capture some of the conundrum is the word she uses. That is to say, the challenges, the uncertainties of learning a new language. Anybody that's ever had to learn a new language, and of course this is one of the problems for many of us, right? We grow up in the language of our culture. We don't learn another language, so we don't appreciate the challenges of learning another language. It makes sense before you graduate from high school that you would challenge yourself to at least learn one other language. I've often had freshmen that ask me, dude, why should I learn another language? They should just learn English. Whoa, 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 whoa. Way wrong answer. First of all, the they who should learn other English is of course silly. Because if you go to another country, you can't expect everybody in that country to speak your English. That would of course be counterintuitive. But why you should learn another language is so that you could learn something about your own language. The process of learning a second language is about learning yourself. And we see this, of course, represented beautifully as well here. Notice as well, to finish with voice, we have the perspective of a child. This is significant, yes, for our notes. We have the perspective of a child who's going to learn things, and then she wants to, notice this, use those things. For example, the word because, as we'll see in a moment. Notice right away that language, the very opening line on page 114, Mammy and Pappy used to speak it when they had a secret they wanted to keep from us. Raised in a bilingual family, English is the secret language, which right away is going to tell her, without her ever realizing it, that English is a language of power, secrets, and the like. Later, she'll report that she felt left out if somebody, for example, was speaking English around them and she didn't understand. The term mother tongue is going to be an important term in this as well. The language you were raised with. Isn't this fascinating?